Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Beiser, and we have another great cast and guest lined up tonight. My guest, she is a professor and game director at Marist University, and she has come on to discuss a little bit about her work, about doing edutainment style games, and anything else that comes to mind. So please welcome to the podcast, Kat Schrier. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. It is a pleasure to have you on, and thank you again for reaching out, expressing interest. I'm always looking for a guest for this series. So for everyone watching, if you are a game designer or interested in talking about some aspect of game dev, please reach out. I am always looking for guests. So since I know we have a whole lot to discuss, to start things off with, Kat, could you talk a little bit about kind of like who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Sure. I've been designing and developing games for the past 20 years plus. I started at places like Nickelodeon and Scholastic in designing games for learning and also engagement. I decided to make a career shift about 13 years ago, and instead I went into academia where I've been teaching and doing research on games and learning. And I'm also the director of the Games and Emerging Media program, a program that I started about 7 years ago.
Nice. And yeah, like for a lot of what I do with game wisdom is definitely trying to, I guess, merge that or bridge that ground between game design and academia. Because I'm sure, as you're well aware, there's a lot to talk about in terms of kind of like the finer points of game design. And I guess that's a good question I want to start with, because I always like to ask this to any like educators or designers who get into the academia space. From the outside, what I've looked at, it seems like talking specifically about game design is still like very much as like alien concept to a lot of people. That when people talk about game design, they think about things from either the programming track or the art track. And like that's how you need to approach how you get started. But I like when I talk and I give like my talks to libraries and schools, I talk about how important game design is and whether or not that can be like its own track that you can go to a school or go to a college and study specifically the aspects of game design. And I want to get your thoughts on that. Like from within academia, like has there been like any movement or change in that respect?
I hope so. I've been trying to do my small part in that. The first thing I do on the first day is I talk about what is that fits into a lot of the myths that people
Mm-hmm.
have around games. So we talk about game programming and that's important, and we talk about game art and how that's really important too. But then I talk about design and why that's important, and it's really about bringing the human into the game, right? So it's really advocating for humans, making sure that humans are able to reach their goals, have fun, enjoy themselves, to get out what we want them to get out of it, whether that's growth, inspiration, maybe it's, just being excited for another episode. Whatever it is, we're hoping for that kind of engagement and we get to craft it, right? So we get to create the rules, we get to create the system, we get to make that world in which you get to explore and grow and learn. And I think that by the end, the students understand that being a designer is just as vital as those other things that we do hear a lot about, like programming and art, which are also very valid as well.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely know we do not have the time to talk more about like the education side of this, but if you are free in the future, I would love to have that chat with you because I think that could be like a good like hour or two conversation easily.
Yes, I could probably talk for hours about it. I love to go through myths about like what
Hmm.
are the most important skills that you need for making games, and a lot of times students will say, "Oh, it must be programming or it must be good artistic experience." And my skill, I think the most important skill is actually listening, like really being able to deeply understand what the audience wants and craft for that audience.
Yeah. And I think like for my own sense of like studying design, a lot from like interviewing designers over the past decade has really been getting a greater appreciation for UI UX conversations and understanding how to present a game to someone. Because again, like I have like for people who watch me, I have played at this point thousands of indie games. I've played from first timers, I played them from established teams, and at this point I've become like a heat-seeking missile to like UI UX issues. Like if there's any problems within the first 10 minutes of a game, I will spot them. And I know that if I spot them, how many consumers are going to spot them as well and just go, nope, I don't want to play this.
Yeah, I actually teach an entire course on UX UI issues. So I call it an introduction to design thinking. And to me, that's really how you're bringing your player, your audience member into your system. It's how you teach them the parts of your system and how they really get educated about what this is and how to orient themselves. And so
Mm-hmm.
the first thing that we do actually is rip apart the Marist website, which is the university where I work, which, it's a fine website, but there's, they because they've just kind of accepted it as a website, they don't necessarily look at it with a critical eye. And once we
Mm-hmm.
start going, we start to see all the issues, especially as we take on the different perspectives of the people that would be going into this website. And so
Mm-hmm.
I get them right away in thinking of those kinds of concepts, but also start them in programs where they could actually create their own UI. So programs like Balsamic and Figma and Adobe XD and other programs that give people the control to be able to play around with different UI systems, but also to get them to be able to test that with users and get that feedback, and that's really how you learn what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it is one of those things, at least for me, I find like once you start thinking about UI UX, once you start thinking about like design like this, it really does change like how you approach games. And it really has affected how I analyze a lot of the titles I get to play. Because it is something that I think for a lot of people, especially like first timers, they're not really thinking about kind of taking that step from, okay, I have a crazy idea for a game, this is like Nintendo level quality. How do I get there? And it is very tricky to kind of put that into words. So I guess as another question for you, like, how do you explain to someone like what UI UX means to a game?
Mm, that's interesting. It's funny that you mentioned Nintendo because I don't think they have the best user interface design. Like I remember like thinking back to the Wii, like, it was kind of hard to, like, figure out, like, how to, like, redesign your Mii. It took me a while to get to even me who likes to play around with it. Like, "Well, how do I redesign my Mii? How do I add it here?" Like, they're not always so good at that. So, even, the top companies may struggle with that. And also, like, depending on who your audience member is, you may not know what works for them or not. So I would say the best way to think about it is just like, how do we want our user to experience our design world? Like, how do we want them to interface with that? Like, what is the interaction point between our system and them? And so, like for instance, I just finished designing a game and then also working with the development team on like a really simple game to teach people about and like again this is a learning game, so teaching people about family planning, so understanding not like the typical user of like people who would need to do family planning, like but like the clinicians, like the people who would go into your hospital room and talk to you about family planning. And so what we found was that they really didn't like we had this like really cool interaction where you could kind of like zoom in on this bulletin board in the break room and you could interact with all the different tutorials, and it was way too complicated. And I knew that I knew I had a little gut feeling about that, but then when I put it in front of actual clinicians, like social workers who might go into a room, they did not know where to go. They didn't know what to click on. They were like trying to click on all these different things in that break room. They didn't realize that this bulletin board was a tutorial. They really hadn't played games at all. And so we really had to simplify it as much as possible so that was just like the very core ideas of how to interact with that interface. That's the only thing that we were left with. And then we kept testing it and testing it until we got it right. And so to me, it's just like really how to help people like move through your space, like to move and navigate and interact with the characters, with the controls, with the content of your game. And luckily, we did a lot of testing, and so we were able to make it a much better game.
And uh, as you were just describing, like that kind of like throwing everything at the player, I'm finishing up my latest design book talking about the real-time strategy genre. And like real-time strategy games have also been like very notorious about just throwing everything at the player using their GUI. And it is again, I think another very easy trap for new designers to fall into is this idea of I want to give the player everything. Like let's just put every single icon and button and flashing symbol on the screen because that's what the player needs to play the game. But then it just turns into this nightmare of where is the player's attention? And I think that again is a very important aspect of the UI UX and game design is being able to again like get in the player's head and understand, okay, if they're playing this game, they're going to be looking at this side of the screen. So maybe I shouldn't put all my important icons like down this little corner that you can barely see. And again, like it's as I was saying a few minutes ago, like for like people like us and for designers who do this on a day-to-day basis or understand this, it's as simple as breathing. Like we can spot these issues almost immediately. But if you're a new designer or you're just coming in, it's like almost like trying to teach someone Latin for the first time about how you go through these UI UX conventions.
Yeah, although it's a little bit surprising how much people do really understand it because, like, for instance, people who are playing it, they know something's wrong. They can't find something. They're telling us in their own way, like, what is working and what isn't working. And also, I'll show my students some wireframes just to like get them in the like understanding the language, the conventions of wireframing, right? And they actually know a lot of it already just from being in a mediated space constantly. So they know what the play button looks like. They know what like an X like for a photo might look like. They already kind of can already kind of guess at it. And so I think we do kind of intuitively know what works and what doesn't for us, but we don't always have the language to describe that. And I think that as you become more and more of an expert in it, you start to gain the critical language that you need to be able to make those changes and explain how it should be changed.
Yep, and again, like I've like with a lot of the games I played some from like first time developers, sometimes even students who this is literally their first game they're made, and it has some fantastic UI UX. And when I talked to them about it, they just said, well, you know what? I played all these games growing up. I knew what I liked. I knew what I hated. I wanted to do the stuff that I liked. And then conversely, I've played games from like industry veterans, which I have combined 15, 20, 30 years of game dev, and the UI UX is horrible. Like, it just does not work. And it's one of those things, as we were saying, that once you start understanding it, it becomes so much easier to do it. But it's just kind of like getting the person like onto that right track is where it's difficult. And I like your example of how people can kind of subconsciously know when something's wrong. Because I've interviewed developers who specialize in doing like play testing and understanding user feedback. And we had that conversation where you can have the same problem and 10 different people will give you 10 different issues, but they're all stemming from that same one problem. And it's up to you to kind of try and figure out, okay, if they're having all these issues, what's kind of like the underlining core of that?
That's great. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, my students who have made a few games at this point, they've created some really innovative and I think really effective UIs in their games. And so I'm excited that they were able to do that so readily in their own game projects.
Hmm. And it is very impressive to see just how much, like, I think kids these days do have access to these tools and the knowledge to create these games. I've done like a few game jams or hosted a few game jams myself, and even from like first timers and younger audiences, they can put out some very impressive stuff. And it is, I think, becoming more and more accessible to people to be able to mess around with game design and do all this stuff. And again, like uh, you've been around. You said I think you've been doing this for about 13 years in terms of the teaching side, and you've been doing these a bit longer. Like again, I remember growing up, there was nothing for game design. You had maybe like something like click and play. Maybe you found like a lucky book on it, but that was it. And today, and I tell this to a lot of the people I give my talks to, like, you can literally, as soon as I'm done talking, you can go online. You can find 4, 5, even more fully available game dev engines that you can play around with. Like, they're completely free. You can do whatever you want with them. And it's, again, like, just such a huge difference from when game design or when the industry first started.
It's true. Even like thinking about my own kids, they certainly they know some of this just by osmosis of living with me, but they also watch these YouTube tutorials on various things. Like my daughter the other day was talking about the uncanny valley, and I'm like, interesting. Like, okay. Or like, they'll talk about things that I wouldn't have thought. Like certainly when I was 9, I was not thinking about UI, but they will understand like UI and they'll know what that means. And sometimes when I'm talking to people who are not gamers, I wonder like how much should I describe like in like define the term UI? Like do they understand that? Do they not? And I still do tell them, but I think this new generation that's growing up already kind of understands those kinds of terms that we kind of had to pick up from the industry, but they're picking up just, all in all of their worlds. So it's great.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think a lot of that has just been like the just complete explosion of like people who cover the video game industry, who talk to designers. It can be, I think, a little bit tricky to find like people who know what they're talking about. I get people who send me videos of, like, can you believe what this person is saying about video games? I'm just like watching and just like in my head going, no, 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 don't say that. But it has become very accessible to like everyone. I mean, even just the rise of streaming and kind of being an influencer and covering games like that. Again, this would have been like the dream job 40 years ago for a lot of people. And now it's just become another everyone can do it kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. I like right now the dream job is like my son wants to be a YouTuber. So it's either like YouTuber or president of the United States. Like there's like, one or the other. Like those are both like the top jobs. So it's kind of funny to think about like that's definitely
Hmm.
not what I was thinking about when I was a kid. Yeah.
Mm-mm. So, one question that I want to ask you, like regarding kind of like the edutainment side of what you do and what you teach. I remember, again, I get to really date myself with this. Again, like the likes of like the Learning Company, Broderbund, and kind of like the '90s era of edutainment. And I wanted to ask you, like, has edutainment, at least from like within the industry, has that changed, or there's been any like major developments over like the past like 5 to 10 years in terms of edutainment design?
Well, I think so because people are definitely more open into it as a possibility, like, the general public is thinking about it. I think in the '90s, people were thinking, "Oh, yeah, this could be, like, a side thing that some kids do," but now, like, for instance, I'm designing games for the World Health Organization, so the WHO. So, like, a few years ago, just not even that long ago, a few years ago, WHO had talked about gaming addiction and talked about, kind of looking down on games. Well, like, now here they are designing games for their own clinicians and training, like I was talking about the family planning game, like, training social workers and nurses and doctors and policymakers using games. So this is like that's like, to me, like a huge change, that it's not just like, oh, like over here in this corner we're doing like these entertaining, but like, it's cool, you get to learn geography like while you're like finding Carmen San Diego, or like, oh, you get to like learn about dysentery, I guess, while you're on the Oregon Trail, like whatever it is, right? But now it's like they're really thinking and about, oh, we can learn it, like we can practice like basic emergency care, we can practice clinical skills and how to empathize with a patient, or understand like when to do hand hygiene in a clinical space, and we can do that through a game. And so that to me is really exciting and a huge change.
Hmm. And you mentioned video game addiction. That's another topic that, especially with the rise of like mobile games and live service, I have thought
Mm,
about quite a bit. One of my books is on the whole free to play market, and just like how much, like, I guess, like the psychological tricks that can go into that. And I remember again, like, it's only been like 4 or 5 years since they were talking about having a loot box law, and then of course COVID hit and everything's kind of like exploded. But it was a very, I think, a turbulent time that we really haven't, I think, grasped like the full ramifications just of how effective these elements are when it comes to video games.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember when the loot box thing kind of came out. I teach a class called Ethics and Games, and every single one of my students wanted to write a paper about loot boxes. I was like, "Whoa, this is definitely the topic of the day." And now everyone's like, "All right, loot boxes, fine, but like, here's the next thing," So it's funny that you mentioned that. But I mean, look, like engaging entertainment is going to engage, right? Whether
Hmm.
it's a really good book, or it's a great game, or it's a amazing opera, like you're going to want to be part of it and feel it more and more. And when we were in the pandemic, we didn't have many other ways to be communicating and connecting with each other. So we're of course going to turn to games. And I think, there's one part of it is, that people could get addicted to things that they're really like, whether it's a game or a really good book. But then there's the moral panics around that, and the way that we think about what addiction is. Like, it was it addiction, or is it just really enjoying something very deeply? It's hard to, uh, you know, it's hard to know. And if someone was like reading for the same amount of time, we probably wouldn't call it an addiction. Why right now? Because it's because of like the morality aspect to it, right? So we
Hmm.
see game playing games as being a problem, quote unquote, but reading a book is a good thing. But like hundreds of years ago, they thought that reading books was a bad thing, and like we should just be talking to each other.
Hmm.
So, I just would urge everybody to like think about, is it really addiction, or is it just that we are thinking that some things are good in our society and some things aren't, even if they could actually be really good, but we just haven't come around to them, or maybe we're afraid of them, or
Hmm.
maybe we, are just going to be scared of this until the next big thing. So, just something to think about.
Hmm. And I work with like a local organization here in New Jersey that's trying to raise awareness and develop video game clubs for libraries and schools. And
Mm,
it is, I think, I think, as you said, like, there's that kind of like a demonization that's been going on. Again, it's been
mm,
happening for the video game industry since the '80s. The whole like Dungeons
yep.
and Dragons, Satanic Panic, and I think
Oh,
it
yeah.
has gone. I think we've moved, at least taken a few steps forward, but it still has been, I think, a very slow moving progress. When I was looking up like ESA statistics, or kind of like people who play video games, again, like we look at the past 10 years. More women have been playing video games. The market has grown. Mobile games, as we were just saying a few minutes ago about video game addiction, like the mobile game space is the most played platform by a large margin these days. And I mean, there is a generation of kids who grew up with having access to free games on their phones that they can just play immediately. And it has, I think, really shifted this conversation. Like, again, like for my audience, like the people who are probably watching me right now or probably watching us, they are like probably more like old school, more like hardcore. They're the ones who have played the Elden Rings, all the
Mm,
From Software games. They probably play a
yeah.
lot of the indie games. So there's definitely that kind of like weird, I guess like just to put my mouth is dying on me. This weird kind of dichotomy between what people consider to be a video game, as in
Yeah.
a very solid spend $20-$40 on it, 8 to 10 hour plus
Mhm.
experience, or a video game is this is a free game that you can play, but here's $10,000 worth of DLC and monetization and skins. And I don't think we've
Yeah.
really had like a way of, I guess, explaining like, is one of those ways better or worse, or are they just like two different approaches to the same kind of content?
Well, to me, I think of them as just different ways to
Hmm.
play, and they're all games. But I think that there definitely is a fan base that, and I'm not saying most people are like this, but there is a subset that kind of are a little bit snobby about what they think is the quote unquote
Ooh,
best
yes.
game or the right way to be a gamer. And then it's kind of like this idea of, like, taste hierarchy is like, "Oh, we watch the cool stuff. You're not really playing games, you're playing the not as good stuff, like the
Hmm.
mobile games. Oh, they're too easy or they're too whatever." And I feel like we as design and I've even heard developers kind of do that too, unfortunately. Like, I've definitely heard some developers who used to do mobile and they would be like, "Oh, our audience is like 35 plus women, like, boohoo," like almost like looking down on their audience. And that really, to me, does the biggest disservice because you should be designing in partnership with your audience. You should
Hmm.
never be holding your audience in contempt and looking down on them. I think that that's actually one of the worst things I could ever imagine is like that you would look down on the people that you're trying to make happy and have a great enjoyable experience. It's just like beyond me. Like, you should be doing what your audience wants and whatever it is that they want and whatever kind of play experience that they'd like to have, that's what matters. And the
Hmm.
snobbiness of game design, I think definitely needs to go. So, the sooner we can get to, like, all of these are different kinds of awesome ways to play, and there's nothing better, nothing worse, just different, I think the better we will be off as a industry.
Yeah, and again, like I remember like 20 or so years ago when the idea of indie was just this like shovelware, the 99
Mhm.
cent game you find like a bin in like a Target or a Walmart. And again, today indie can mean like one of the most like artistically defining titles you will ever find.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've to your comment about like developers, I've heard it too. I kind of skulk around on a lot of like social media, and I've seen developers who will look down on everything. They will look down on a mobile game. They'll look down games that are too hard. They'll look down games that are too easy. Is it too
Yep.
story driven? Is it not enough
Yep.
story driven? Again,
Yep.
you pick a type of game, and there will be people who will view it as not, it's not a video game or it's not a
Yeah.
game. And I
So
think
true.
part of like understanding or growing in terms of my own like an analytical point of view over the last 20, or I'm sorry, 14 years now, jeez, it's been a long time, has been being able to appreciate every single game. Do I like every genre I play? No. but I can understand why someone would like this. And being able to convey that, I think, is more important than just saying, oh, this game gets a 10 out of 10, this game gets a 1 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree, and there's also a lot of audiences that are still underserved, right? Like, you think of, like,
Yes.
over 50 gamers, right? Like, why aren't we making more games for people who are over 50, right? Why aren't we making games for families to play with each other? Like, there really aren't as many of those that are out there, and so that means that, you know, we if we have this narrow definition of who is the true gamer or who is the true game, then we're not gonna get that diversity of games that we need to really understand each other, but also to be able to play and you know,
Yeah.
I'm sure I don't know about you, but when I'm over 50, I'm gonna wanna keep playing games. It's not
Hmm.
that long off for me, and so I really hope we keep making games for all of
Yep.
us.
Yep. And I just finished covering Ludo Narracon, and just a huge like diversity and spectrum of games, very different storytelling, very different conventions of mechanics. And again, there are people I know even within my audience who the second you say visual novel or walking simulator or whatever, they just immediately shut off. Like it's not their kind of game, and that's fine. But again, there are plenty of underserved markets when it comes to the game industry, especially about stories that are unique and that deal with, different cultures, different demographics. And the indie space has been, I think, one of the forerunners of trying to get these stories told. I mean, you would never see, I think, a AAA studio make a game like, what was it, like Thirsty Suitors from last year, or just, again, all the games we see covering stuff like love and loss, or dealing with a death in a family. You would never see Activision
Yeah.
Blizzard have do a game like that as a Call of Duty
Yeah.
spinoff.
Yeah, I know, it's like I think about a game like, That Dragon Cancer, which is
Mm-hmm.
about, like, love and loss and things like that. So, it and, I have my students play it, and they are so moved by it, and it helps them to kind of feel vulnerable and open up about their own, experiences of loss and cancer and grief, and imagine if we didn't have games like that, where we
Mm-hmm.
could be more open and more empathetic to each other and feel like we can share our own stories and our own unique perspectives. If we ju I mean, and I'm not saying look, I mean, I like playing Call of Duty, I like playing Grand Theft Auto, I think that's important too, and I like talking about those games, but we should have a lot of different kinds of games so we can speak to different parts of who we are.
I guess like as a final question, and hopefully this won't be too long of an answer from you, I wanted to, I guess, to wrap things up with for now. I guess what is the most important lesson you try to instill in students or first-time developers when it comes to game design? Because again, the horror and beauty of game design is you can go any which way. I have interviewed developers who started like being like investment bankers who they decide one day I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go make games. I've talked to students who right out of college, even when they're in high school, just go, you know what? I want to make a game. I want to make something creative like that. And again, like there's so much information out there that it can be sometimes very daunting to kind of get started. So for you and for what you teach, like what is kind of like the first or even just like the most important lesson you try to get someone to understand when it comes about learning game design?
There are a few different lessons, so I'm like, which one's most important? Because I think, like, I mean, there's some quick lessons, like go do stuff, like go abroad, go play a sport, play an instrument, do these kinds of experiences so that you can bring that back to your game design. And also, always talk about balance and like not just being about luck or not just being about skill, but finding that right balance. But I think the most important lesson that I've taught them is the importance of playtesting and testing again. And it was really fulfilling a few weeks ago because I realized that they actually learned that lesson. So I'm always talking about playtest early and often, just get it on paper, doesn't need to be pretty, could be a rough draft. Just get it out there. And I think I talked about it so much that we actually had a group of people who were working on a board game come in and play test their game with us. Yeah, so the one rule that I have my students follow is that they have to be just listening and watching and observing and not try to get in the way or give instructions. They really should just be asking questions and listening to the answers or just watching people play. And so we had this group come in and play test their game with us, and they broke every single rule of playtesting. For instance, they we would try to give them feedback. They didn't want to hear it. They said, "No, you're wrong. This is why
Mm.
you're wrong." They while we were playing their game, they were telling us strategies. They were like, "You should play like this. You should play like that." They were telling us how to play the game. And and then when we tried to give them feedback, they were not open to it at all. They just said no, and they just like didn't write anything down.
Mm.
Clearly were against everything that we had tried to explain. And so I in the middle of this, I finally said, "Okay, lesson time. I know that you're a guest and you're doing playtesting here with my students, but I need to tell you some ground rules for how to do playtesting." And then I kind of had to go through a lesson in playtesting with them, and every time they tried to speak up and say, "No, but you're wrong, but," I had to say, "No," you know?
Mhm.
No speaking, like, "Shh," like, "Be quiet," because they just weren't open to any feedback. And so I was really happy because I felt like my students, at least, had really, like, lived my under like, to me, like, how we should do playtesting. They lived it so much that when they saw other people doing it wrong, they knew right away. And so I felt like I had really imparted that lesson quite well to them. And then, had someone come in to really g bring it on home as to why doing playtesting is so important.
As you're as you're just telling that story, my mind is just like I can hear like the warning lights or the air raid sirens going off in my head about that. 'Cause I've heard that from other developers who like were at conventions and they just like watch like someone like the booth next to them just had that exact excuse me, that exact same interaction. And oh my goodness. It's one of those things that once you know like kind of like the proper way of doing it, it's very easy, but yeah, again, like people will argue, and I've had, consumers and fans argue with me to the death about, oh, you're looking at this game wrong, or why can't you just do like that. And again, it's that situation of if someone can't figure this out, or if they're having problems with it, that doesn't mean the problem's on them. That's the
Yeah,
problem of the game. And
exactly.
yes, maybe, if you have an audience of 200,000 people who play your game, and if 10,000 of them can't figure it out, some people will be like, well, who cares? But again, that those are people you hear about. There are so many people who will try a game because maybe out of feedback or interest from someone, and they'll just bounce off it completely, and they're never coming back. And again, it's one of those things I talk so much about with what I do with Game Wisdom is about kind of trying to be sustainable in the industry. And if you're not learning these lessons on your first, second, third game, your audience is going to shrink. And if you think that 100,000 people who tried your first game are going to come back to find the same issues in game number 5, they're not. And you're going to wake up
Yeah.
to find that maybe that audience of 100,000 is maybe 20,000 now. But you budgeted your game thing that you're going to have so many more sales, and now where are you?
And, like, not even I mean, the sales are definitely important, but
Mhm.
it's also like your game is just not gonna be as good. And
Yep.
it's also like, to me, I think of playtesting as a way to connect with your audience. That builds the relationship. And so to build it, you have to listen, you have to be open, you have to feel like you're equal to your audience, right? You can't think
Mhm.
you're above, and you can't kind of have contempt for them. And I got the sense that this group coming in definitely had contempt for gamers. And right, as I
Mhm.
as I mentioned, we wanna make sure that we are equal. We're all equal to each other, and we're equal to our players, and they're equal to us.
Yep. So again, I could chat with you for another hour or two easily on this, but I know
Yeah,
you have
that's
to get.
okay. I do have to go now. Yeah.
So, to kind of end things for our conversation, do you have anything you would like to mention in terms of social media? Any projects you'd like to promote? Anything like that?
Sure. So there's my LinkedIn profile is Kat Schrier. I can send that to you if you want. I have Dr. Gamer Mom is my uh, X or Twitter account, and also my Instagram account. And then my website is Plataplay, so Platy play.com. And that's it.
All right. Well, Kat, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you this afternoon. Like I said, if you are free in the future, there's so many more things we can discuss. I would love to have you back on.
Thank you so much.
Not a problem. So, for everyone watching, we're going to end things here for this episode of the cast. If you're new to the YouTubing stuff, you'll find links to everything Kat mentioned down below, so be sure to check them out. As I said at the start, if you'd like to come on and chat about game design or game dev, please get in touch, do the YouTubing stuff, buy all the copies of my books, all that marketing plug. And with that said, come back for the other questions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. And Kat, have a great rest of your night as well, and I will definitely be here to chat with you again in the future.
Thank you so much.
Not a problem. So everyone, have a great rest of your day, and see you for our next chat.